This video is sponsored by the lovely members of my Patreon and by CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a fantastic educational video service which provides so many award-winning documentaries and specials, giving you fantastic content. Right now, I am watching their Women of History series, which is absolutely superb. It has been fun for me, you know, even though they're still problematic, love hearing about the monarchy and the trash they get up to. It's really informative, really fun, and it has a really great range of female historical figures that they're discussing. And when you sign up for CuriosityStream, you'll also get access to Nebula, where I and many other YouTubers have exclusive fun content on there. For me, for example, I have videos about WandaVision, at least before the finale, a review of Soul, and a video coming up later this very week that if you were enjoying the Meghan Markle, Prince Harry tea, well, you're gonna be drinking some good stuff. It's really fun, really informative. It allows creators like myself, Kat Black, Sarah Zed, and others to do content that may not be as well received here on YouTube. And CuriosityStream was generous enough to give a discount code to me and mine. So if you put in CuriosityStream/MillionairePendulum, you'll get 26% off the annual subscription. I cannot wait to see you guys there, and thank you so much for your support, and let's get into the video. When Lovecraft Country first aired on August 16th, 2020, it did so to a huge amount of critical acclaim and audience approval. The series got just under 1 million viewers in the States and set the foundation for a show that was going to be very solid. A Black ensemble in Jim Crow's America where the threats weren't just eldritch terrors, but the police system. It was an honestly great hook, especially when this was during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests taking place and conversations about the racist culture that created policing was already in the ecosphere. Then, as it continued, the praise started to wane and Black viewers, especially Black queer viewers like myself, were more and more frustrated about the places the series decided to go. While more people watched the finale than the premiere, it felt like momentum was lost, and people were disappointed in where the road ended. As of this recording at least, Lovecraft Country has not been renewed. So what the fuck happened?
What's the matter? Where you going, black boy?
Black boy, we're the welcoming committee.
You'd better get out of here.
No, Jackie.
Go on, it just makes it tough for having you here.
In the first episode of Lovecraft Country, we're introduced to Atticus Freeman, a Korean War veteran traveling from Florida back to his hometown of Chicago. He has received a vague and ominous message from his estranged father, Montrose, saying that he has a birthright waiting for him in Ardham, Massachusetts.
The place he wants me to go with him is in Lovecraft Country. The letter says,
his uncle George, who publishes a Green Book-style travel guide, decides to go with him. They are joined by Tick's childhood friend, Letitia Lewis, also known as Letty, who is supposed to be stopping off at a certain point, but ends up going with them the whole way. After being harassed by a lynch mob, targeted by a racist sheriff attempting to outrun the sun, and nearly eaten by Lovecraftian monsters called Shoggoths, they find the Ardham Lodge and meet its occupants. They meet William, a mysterious butler, Christina Braithwaite, daughter of the sorcerer Samuel Braithwaite. Atticus was lured to Ardham because Tick's blood is part of a powerful ritual that will give the leaders immortality, because he is a descendant of their lodge's originator and a slave that he raped. In order to save the lives of his father, uncle, and Letty, Tick agrees to sacrifice himself. The ritual, however, is sabotaged by Christina and they escape. But George, who was shot during the climax of the second episode, succumbs to his wounds.
Miles gone. Oh, I wanna come here and give every part of me.
Within the first 2 episodes of Lovecraft Country, we get a setup about this series is going to be about Atticus attempting to reclaim his family birthright and something was being kept from them. Then that plot line ended very quickly and we got the anthology series that, unless you were a book reader, did not really line up with how the show had been presented or what we expected. Now, this is not inherently a bad thing, and there's been a lot of discussion about just because something wasn't what you expected doesn't mean it's bad. However, I think the writing was not able to cash the checks the series wanted to write, for example. Episode 3 is about Letty getting an unexpected inheritance and buying an old Victorian mansion on the north side, the all-white north side. Their house is haunted by a racist murder ghost, and her neighbors are also racist. Sometimes you literally just cannot win. This is some good wine. Letty learns that the previous owner was a white scientist named Hiram Epstein, and there are some interesting conversations about how this character can be read as anti-Semitic, but I do not have the range for that conversation and I couldn't find any really in-depth articles about it, so if you know any, please feel free to leave them in the comments. We find out that with the help of the racist Sheriff Lancaster, he kidnapped, experimented on, and killed 8 black people before burying them under the house. All 9 spirits are trapped together.
The last owner of the house was a man named Hiram Epstein. Epstein was a scientist at the University of Chicago until he was fired for unethical experimental practices.
Unethical how?
The article doesn't say, but I think he was experimenting on humans. 8 bodies were found in my basement.
With the help of a medium, a black voodoo woman who is murdered or not murdered, even though her powers are able to have a shield, it's unclear, you know, With the help of the medium, the black spirits, Letty banishes Epstein's malevolent ghost. While this episode isn't bad at all, it sets up a few things that will become a problem later on. But let's put a pin in that and talk about the episode where shit truly gets rough. A History of Violence is the episode I think hurt the show the most. Written by showrunner Misha Green and directed by Victoria Mahoney, the episode has Montrose, Tick, and Letty breaking into a museum to get the Book of Names. They end up reanimating the corpse of an Arawak two-spirited person named Yahima. Yahima explains that Braithwaite, the original one, kidnapped them and locked them in the vault after they translated the pages for him in the Book of Names. Yahima agrees to leave with them and the vault begins to flood. They barely escape. And after escaping, when they are finally back home in Chicago, Montrose brutally and cruelly murders Yahima to keep them from revealing more information about the pages. This is also the episode that establishes the sexual relationship between William, Christina, and Ruby. That's a whole thing. There are many layers to why this episode was so frustrating. The murder of an indigenous two-spirited person. The fact that that character was introduced and used as a hypersexualized plot device. The fact that it was Montrose who did it. Missing and murdered indigenous women is something that plagues many communities across the world. When it comes to indigenous women, they are 10 times more likely to be killed than the national murder rate. Despite how high these statistics seem, they only cover a small percentage of all the Native women who are victims of violence every year. Now, Yahima is not a woman. They are two-spirited, but in a female-presenting body and portrayed by a cis woman. That image and her cruel death both provided a bit of rare Native representation and then yanked it away for no real reason. There's also a discussion about how the show uses the term two-spirit to describe Yahima. According to the Indian Health Services, though two-spirit may now be included in the umbrella of the LGBTQ bracket, the term two-spirit does not simply mean someone who is Native American, Alaskan Native, and gay or queer. In most tribes, they were considered neither men nor women. They occupied a distinct alternative gender status. In tribes where two-spirited males and females were referred to within the same term, this status amounted to a third gender. In other cases, two-spirited females were referred to with a distinct term and therefore constituted a fourth gender. So all of this is very different depending on which tribe that you are talking about. Most indigenous communities have some specific terms within their own languages for gender variant members of their communities and the social and spiritual roles that they fulfill. So even though we treat this two-spirited term as a pan-Indian term, not all cultures perceive two-spirited people the same way. The Arawak people that Yahima are supposed to be a part of are indigenous to South America and the Caribbean. One of the most famous Arawak people is actually Tituba from the Salem witch trial. Technically, she was an Arawak Bahamian woman. I think this episode was the one that made people suspicious of the show, if it was being horrific for simply the sake of horror. Misha Green shared on Twitter, I wanted to show the uncomfortable truth that oppressed folks can also be oppressors, but I didn't examine or unpack the moment portrayal of Yahima as thoroughly as I should have. It is a story point worth making, but I failed in the way I chose to make it. Hashtag Lovecraft Country. But I think for many, this was the clear beginning of an uncomfortable relationship between Lovecraft Country and trauma, especially with the character of Montrose, who was a closeted gay man who watched his lover be murdered in front of him as he barely survived the Tulsa race riots. It is at this point I think it's worth bringing up the book that inspired this entire production. Lovecraft Country was a 2016 dark fantasy horror novel by Matt Ruff, a white man, with pretty much the same premise. While hitting a lot of the same overall beats, the book makes very different choices. Some of them include George doesn't die. Hippolyta is always an empowered character who gets to go on tours. Diana is a boy named Horace and is cursed temporarily, but not to the extent that Diana is on the show. Yahima, Gia, and many of the other characters simply do not exist. Letitia is not primarily just Tick's love interest, which would love that. Christina was a male character named Caleb. Ruby outsmarts Caleb / Christina and is not dead by the end of the series. Montrose is not gay, and while abusive, slightly less extreme than the show, there's a lot less focus on Black trauma and death as explicitly as the show makes it. From the transition from a white author to Black showrunner, there seems to have been a desire to highlight a lot of Black horror trauma, something that I think ultimately divided Black audiences. The book is fine. It certainly has its audience, but I was truly surprised about how nearly every issue I saw Black audience members discussing wasn't present in the book, save for colorism. Lovecraft Country, the show, was trying to be more ambitious about Black horror, and I think that can sometimes be hard to process because the horror show of Black identity is still going on. It's not like we have figured out anti-Blackness. By invoking Emmett Till, the Tulsa race riots, and other moments in Black history, I don't think Green was trying to harm people, but simply use her Black American experience to tell and delve deeper into this story. The biggest problem is that while it does go deeper, it sometimes doesn't think about what the images are saying, which takes us to my favorite topic, colorism, which I have discussed at length. If you're unclear with the definition, literally you can go watch my Bridgerton video, I bring it up there. One of the hardest episodes for me to rewatch was Rewind 1921. In this episode, our core three, Montrose, Letty, and Tick, have to go to the 1921 Tulsa riots in order to recover the Book of Names, which was burned during the riots. Letty has been given invulnerability by Christina, which makes her unable to be killed. Good for she. Montrose almost instantly has PTSD from the whole thing and has a whole crisis with Tick because that's all they do every single episode. It's like, just go to therapy. Letty ends up having to get the Book of Names herself from Tick's grandmother after explaining that they are from the future, she is carrying her great-grandson, etc., etc., etc. During the emotional end of the episode, we watched Tick's grandmother burn alive next to Letty as she is untouched by the fire. Then she takes her sweet time walking through the slaughter of all of these darker skinned people as Hippolyta damn near dies trying to keep the portal open so she can finally come through it after taking a nice breezy stroll. Watching these scenes, I just couldn't help but wonder, how could this Black female-led production not see that Letty is the only light-skinned Black woman in the show, and she is put in this position to be a foil to every brown to dark-skinned woman who isn't being protected, isn't being loved, and isn't being cared for. While I was making the final tweaks on this video, it came out that an extra from the set of Lovecraft Country gave details about her skin being darkened, who was going to appear briefly in a photograph, and they darkened her skin and they darkened her hands according to statements. Now, it really be your own people, don't it? I find this so astounding. And I just had to come back and discuss this because I feel like this, at its core, is the big problem with Lovecraft Country, and why, even though there are things that I think are good about it, why it frustrates me so much. This is unacceptable for a Black-led production. Like, to have a Black showrunner, to have a Black production, to do all this stuff, and to have these very basic colorist things happen is not just an oversight. You know, it's just, it's embarrassingly terrible. In the small things, it could do to be a more progressive, more introspective show, it just simply did not do that. And that is its ultimate failing as a show, among many other reasons. But yeah, had to throw that in there because of course this would happen too. It was not very powerful for me to watch her slow walk through Black Death created by some weird white magic that only seems to be given to her. And it didn't exist in the source material, so it was extra jarring to see her elevated to this point. In contrast, Ruby's set up as this weird Uncle Tom type who secretly wants to be a white woman.
Think Marshall Fields hasn't hired you because you're colored?
Of course I know that, and I'm willing to work harder than anybody else, if that's what it's gonna take. You know, if more colored folks thought like me, the race would be a lot further along.
And rapes a white man with her heels during Cardi B. Hippolyta abandons her daughter during a major time of crisis, and while I Am is the best episode of the series, it's still a lot to deal with, and she never has to make do with the fact that she left her daughter. Diana is left to deal with layer and layer of trauma and then eventually murder the big bad after losing her arm. Meanwhile, Letty gets to be this virginal, sexual, maternal figure who is completely absorbed into Tick's orbit and loses all relationship to her character. Even when they have sex for the first time, something that should be so personal, it's all about Tick's toxic masculinity over controlling her.
Me and her, we used to tussle back in high school, if you know what I'm saying. And I'm feeling nostalgic tonight.
And he takes her virginity roughly in a scene that is not rape, but just reads very uncomfortably. It doesn't do any of them any favors. And it is this repeated inability to balance out complex characterization with plot and story that makes it such a frustrating show to watch as it wraps up, especially since it had a perfect foil that came out only months before.
What are you two talking about?
Oh, nothing. Just the end of the world.
I've already spoken about Watchmen before, so I'll be brief. Watchmen was an HBO sequel series to the Alan Moore comic showing the aftermath of Ozymandias' plot to unify the world using a giant squid attack and how it changes the course of history. The lead is Angela Abar, played by Regina the King. Watchmen and Lovecraft Country are very similar. They even have a big portion of their story involving the Tulsa Race Massacre. However, the difference between them really boils down to how the writing ultimately handles the scope of the story. For example, Gia's episode Meet Me in Daegao. Gia, played by my beloved Jamie Chung, who I met one time. She's beautiful and gorgeous and totally nice. Like everything that you would wish she is if you're a fan like I am. It is a flashback episode where we see Tick being complicit in the military-industrial complex and shooting one of Gia's friends without even blinking. You can tell that this episode is speaking to the way that black men and black people get brought into fighting wars that pit them against other people of color. The whole oppressed people can be oppressors. Yet it then becomes a romance and Tick and Gia fall in love, and all of that complexity never gets fully explored. But they make a whole production of highlighting and putting a heavy hand on those issues visually and narratively. In contrast, Watchmen does something very similar, but with Vietnam. In this AU, America wins the Vietnam War, and it is considered a state, so there are American soldiers stationed there. We see the Vietnamese people doing violent protests against the American military occupying them, and Angela's parents are murdered as a result of this kind of clashing. The exact same point is being made, but because there isn't a star-crossed romance, and Angela is our protagonist, not her parents, we can see how that trauma is passed down through all these brown people, hurting each other in the name of an American colonization system that none of them are really a part of. This moment is also important to the world bending of the show, the structure of Angela's identity herself, and fits into the Watchmen universe going back to the comics. whereas Gia's story only exists as a plot device. There is no larger point to it except establishing her character so she can come up later and help. Her trauma is well written and the episode is well acted, but it is overall meaningless, and you could take it out of the series and you would miss nothing except needing her to come up to do one thing at the finale. So that's just narratively unsatisfying. So much of Lovecraft Country's trauma goes nowhere story-wise, and that's why it doesn't feel satisfying even though it is more ambitious than Watchmen. It all comes down to writing. Now I just want to talk about some stuff that bug me. I have seen so many people find Christina more sympathetic than Montrose, and it makes me sick. Remember those show villains versus actual villains memes on Twitter? Well, someone did that for Christina versus Montrose, and I was just like, wow. Christina is a gender-bent version of the male character Caleb in the book. And Christina's whole thing is like, I'm a woman, so they won't let me be in this racist cult. So she does all of these things to empower her, but all of it just is very off and boring because it's like, so you want to have female white supremacy girl boss to do what? In the book, Caleb isn't even really the big bad. It is the sheriff who curses the Diana male character. So they elevate Christina's role into this big bad role. They also make it a very weird rape queer storyline with her and Ruby, because in the book that character was a man and the reveal of their gender was in a whole moment, and there's just a lot more autonomy of Ruby in the book, even though the entire situation is always going to be a little squicky. It speaks volumes that people could relate more to Christina's white feminism than Montrose's multiple layers of trauma. I personally think that Montrose is the best character on the show despite everything, because my fellow Brooklynite, Michael K. Williams, he don't miss. He's an icon, one of the greatest black actors living today. All the flowers for a king. For me, he is the character I understood the most and felt went on the best journey. Yes, he was dark and a murderer and dealing with so many issues, like he is very unlikable, but it's excellently written and I understood exactly why he was the way he was. Even Tick, who annoyed the shit out of me, like to the end. I understood him, but he was still annoying to me. But Montrose, I get him. I prefer Montrose. Fuck Christina. She's a racist girl boss. Cause she's queer, she gets stands. Fuck that. Like, that's such a low, low bar. One of the things I found really fascinating is that at the end of Lovecraft Country, the book, no one dies from the core cast. Despite my mixed feelings about the book, that stood out to me. While I think most of the characters are blander in the book, I think the show, again, more ambitious, more interesting. But at the end of Lovecraft Country, the book, they just take away Caleb's magic after they defeat the actual big bad and give him a mark of Cain, which will prevent him from doing magic and going to magical places. Tick is never sacrificed or attempted to be sacrificed. The ending of the book before the epilogue, I think, is really interesting. You think this is over just because Lancaster's lodge is destroyed? Braithwaite said. It's not over. There are other lodges all over America. They know about you now and they'll be coming for you, but not like I did. They won't think of you as family or even as a person. They won't leave you alone until they get what they want from you. No matter where you go, you'll never be safe. But he had to break off, for suddenly Atticus burst out laughing. Letitia and George and Hippolyta and the others laughed too. Even Montrose, who up to now had been feeling surly about the fact Braithwaite was getting away alive. What? Braithwaite shouted, looking at them as if they were crazy. What's so funny? Oh, Mr. Braithwaite, Atticus said, finally wiping tears from his eyes. What is it you're trying to scare me with? You think I don't know the country I live in? I know. We all do. We always have. You're the one who doesn't understand. Still laughing, they got into the van and drove away. Caleb Braithwaite remained standing out in the cold long after their taillights had vanished into the distance. Half an hour later, when the Indiana State Trooper rolled up, he was still standing there, slack-jawed in the dark, with a map book in his fist, like a lost traveler trying to work out where and how he'd gone wrong. This felt stronger and less traumatic than having their child character murder, Tick die, and to kill off another queer character. The book isn't at all perfect, but I found this conclusion to the characters' collective journey to be superior, because sometimes it's nice to have everybody live.
Everybody lives
once, Rose. Just this once. Everybody lives!
Lovecraft Country ended up being largely mediocre to many, but that's fine because Black-led media should not always have to be held to an unrealistic high standard. But it was an ambitious, well-made piece of work. I think that the problem with it is that sometimes the writing wasn't that strong, and that's okay. I'm glad it was made. However, what is important that we know as Black creators is that there is a standard being set, and unlike certain Black creators, we cannot lean on trafficking in colorist and heteronormative stereotypes to make our mark. Lovecraft Country also had the misfortune to be sandwiched between Watchmen and I May Destroy You. Watchmen was whiter in terms of behind the scenes, but the storytelling was just tighter while hitting a lot of the same issues. I May Destroy You was blacker, daring, and also exceptionally well done, a true masterpiece that had nuance and just touched on a bunch of issues, had flawed characters while having a powerful central story. It was just better written. In comparison, Lovecraft Country wasn't as strong, but, and I want to emphasize this, that does not make it a terrible show. I really enjoyed it overall, and I think that Misha Green is very talented, but it fell short because it wanted to do so much, but forgot that even within the Black community, there are more vulnerable among us. And they didn't put them first, and they didn't deliver a narrative that stuck the landing. I look forward to seeing Misha Green work on Tomb Raider, but I hope that she took the criticism into consideration if this show doesn't get a second season. I think part of it is the source material being anthologized, but I also think when it comes down to it, the choices that were made were choices that were not in the book. It was all Misha Green. And I think that points to just how interesting she is as a creator, but also how hard it is to adapt something where people have certain expectations. Because if it was up to me, I'd have switched Letty and Ruby's characters from the beginning. Because just like with Pokemon, I'm Team Ruby.